It's a bungle in the jungle, and that's all right by me. It's NES Works, episode 79. This week we have what is, in my opinion, one of the more unfairly maligned games in the NES library. God knows Rambo from Pack-In Video is not an amazing masterpiece, but it is a game full of big intentions and some respectable ambitions and creative choices. But as with other chaotic good games on NES Works, you have to admire the effort put on display here. Choices were definitely made with this game, for better and for worse. But you know, at least the creators weren't just coasting on autopilot. It's also weird as hell, and it's frequently messy, but it's certainly far less of a disaster than many people would have you believe. Rambo is one of a handful of licensed titles on NES that aspires to be something more than just a standard platformer or basic action game that's been wallpapered to vaguely resemble some sort of media property. Like Pack-In's eventual take on Die Hard, this genuinely feels like the developers spent time thinking about what could be done with the property in question. They didn't entirely succeed, but they tried, and that counts for something. In this case, the property in question is Sylvester Stallone's propaganda platform, Rambo First Blood Part 2. The original First Blood was a violent thriller with a message, a scornful critique of the way the US had drafted tens of thousands of young men into the meat grinder of the Vietnam War, then left them stricken, traumatized, and forced to return to civilian life with little support when they became a politically inconvenient living reminder of the country's failure to arrest the spread of communism in East Asia. 3 years later, the sequel was kind of a reminder that American soldiers remained detained in Vietnam a decade after the end of the war, but rather than presenting America's relationship with its vets as a systemic failure, it instead paints the country's shortcomings as the results of a few bureaucratic bad apples. More to the point, it was an excuse for Stallone to get greased up and snarl as he gunned down commies in a blur of explosive revenge porn against foreigners. Of course, this was all just prep work for Rambo to head over to Afghanistan, where he would help our friendly, freedom-fighting pals, the lovable Taliban. Happily, the NES game doesn't really get into any of this. There's a small amount of narrative here, but what little you see of the American military leadership treats them as cartoonish buffoons. Mostly, Rambo for NES is an excuse to take control of a crude 8-bit rendition of Stallone as he guns down 8-bit commies. Except there's not a lot of gunning here since firearms are relatively scarce, and you spend a lot more time fighting bugs, animals, and much stranger creatures than you do commies. It's a weird game. It's worth noting, however, that a big part of that weirdness comes from the way developer Pack-In Video has attempted to embrace the trends of the NES era. This wasn't Pack-In's first encounter with John Rambo. The studio had already produced not one but two Rambo games for the MSX home computer in Japan by the time this one shipped. Called Rambo and Super Rambo Special, these were essentially two versions of the same basic game concept. And that concept was pretty much military hide-lied. This is especially obvious in the original game, whose limited colors and controls make it a remarkably literal attempt to ape TNE Soft's computer hit, all the way down to the brick-style status frame surrounding the action, which involves simplistic contact-based melee combat in simplistic jungle mazes. Super Rambo Special, whose name is almost certainly a deliberate echo of Hide-Light Follow-Up Hide-Light Special, is a little more ambitious, with line-of-sight stealth and weapon procurement so familiar that you would be tempted to accuse Pack-In Video of ripping off Metal Gear, if not for the fact that Super Rambo predates Metal Gear on MSX by about a year. And now here we are on NES, and the studio's take on Rambo takes a shift into free-roaming, side-scrolling territory. After all, that's what was big on NES. Even Nintendo agreed, with their own Hide-Light-inspired action RPG, The Legend of Zelda, becoming a side-scrolling action-adventure for its first sequel. Let there be no question that Pack-In Video was simply following Nintendo's lead. Rambo is not just an action RPG in the platformer vein, it is very specifically a Zelda 2 clone. Although it actually predates Zelda 2's arrival in the US by half a year, in Japan it shipped about 10 months after the Famicom Disk System version of Zelda 2 debuted. That's more than enough time for an 8-bit game to be planned out, programmed, manufactured, and distributed. The thing is, Rambo embracing the action RPG platformer format isn't the result of some inexplicable whim. This is a Zelda 2 knockoff, sure, but at the same time, it consciously echoes the MSX games that predate it. The brick frame has become a tool icon bar running along the top of the screen, but there's no mistaking their familial relationship. Rambo for NES adapts the jungle roaming action combat in Pack-In's computer titles for something better suited to the NES audience. That means it moves a little faster, and Rambo can now jump and attack more directly, but the core components are really pretty similar. You make your way through a jungle maze, gathering weapons as you work your way toward an enemy base to find evidence of American POWs and eventually rescue them. While Rambo can collect all manner of ranged weapons here, including throwing knives, explosive arrows, assault rifles, and grenades, you ultimately rely a lot on Rambo's trusty trench knife. The combat here isn't quite so short range as on MSX, but the NES maintains that spirit by giving the basic knife strike an annoyingly short attack range that makes it largely worthless against more powerful enemies. That means you need to find enemies who will consistently drop specific weapon types and grind endlessly on them to max out your ammo. And that's not the only form of grinding to be done here. This is, after all, a Zelda 2 clone, and that means every time you kill an enemy, a tiny little number floats out of its vanishing corpse. That number adds up to experience, and once you hit certain experience totals, Rambo's attack strength increases. This doesn't improve the range of his knife attacks, but it does mean tough enemies go down in far fewer strikes. And when you defeat a boss, it drops, yes, a heart container that adds to Rambo's HP max. This is a pretty rough take on the action RPG, even compared to Zelda 2 and Castlevania 2, but you can definitely see what Pack-In Video was going for here. Accordingly, the designers also included some cursory story elements that loosely follow the film's major beats. While Rambo lacks Zelda 2's extensive overworld, the jungle contains a few points where you can interact with other characters, including a remote Vietnamese village and a Soviet-run POW camp. Talking to NPCs in these areas provides guidance for the overall quest, though this can be a bit useless at times thanks to the confusing layout of the game world map. For the most part, you really need to just hit the NPC points to advance the story at key moments or after achieving certain directives. Rambo is initially sent into the jungle by his former commanding officer, Colonel Troutman, to gather conclusive proof that the USSR is illegally detaining American soldiers. There are a number of smaller quests along the way, such as locating Rambo's local contact, Ko, finding a lamp to use to navigate a network of extremely Zelda 2-like pitch-black caves, rescuing a child, and so on. Some of these beats emerge from gameplay needs, of course, while others echo moments in the movie. For example, at one point the captain of your boat attempts to betray and kill Rambo, which lacks much in the way of build-up or motive in-game, but makes a lot more sense if you've seen the film. Admirably, Pack-In Video even attempted to add a small amount of player freedom to the game. Most of this amounts to nothing, of course. You can choose to follow your orders to the letter and only procure photographs of the POWs, but if you do that, Colonel Troutman breaks the fourth wall, sends you back into the jungle, and requires you to bring them back home. More interestingly, the biggest deviance from the film involves Ko. Although she dies in the film, your actions here determine whether she lives or dies. Somewhat counterintuitively, saving her life requires you to completely ignore her when you see her injured at the waterfall. Apparently her injuries had a Schrödinger-like quality to them, and if you don't confirm her death, it never actually happens. Even more interestingly, Ko actually becomes playable at one point in the game. Rambo is briefly captured and tortured by the Soviets, at which point the focus of the action shifts to Ko. Her sequence doesn't involve combat, since all the occupying forces have no reason to suspect she's anything other than a simple villager. But that makes it all the more interesting. Here's a playable portion of the game that forces you to change characters strictly for the sake of advancing the story, something that certainly hadn't been seen on the NES to this point. For that matter, what NES games have even featured narratives at this point? Although Rambo certainly had some precedent and predecessors on Famicom in Japan, here in the US, Acclaim was pretty much breaking new ground. I mean, Dragon Power kind of had a story, if by story you mean a sporadic glurge of confusing jabber that makes no sense without the context provided by intimate familiarity with the source material, whereas this, on the other hand, stands more or less on its own. It's not great, and the translation quality could use a lot of work, but it is a big step forward for the NES. Where Rambo falls short is in its gameplay. It's all well and good for Pack-In Video to have traced over the interesting, experimental, RPG-inspired portions of Zelda 2, but they also brought over a whole lot of the bad stuff. Lacking a world map viewpoint, the entire world of Rambo consists of interconnected side-scrolling areas. Rivers, jungles, villages, bases, and mountains. But unlike, say, Castlevania 2, where the interconnected areas are mostly contiguous and linear, the environments in Rambo line up in unintuitive and confusing ways. Sure, Castlevania 2, as we'll see, had a few areas where you made one-way advances or took context-specific side paths. But Rambo's entire world map is the equivalent of hitting your head against Deborah Cliff. Every screen essentially runs along an east-west axis, but the jungle can also be traversed along a north-south axis as well. However, you only have limited opportunities to make those moves, which are denoted by small N or S icons on the ground that you can enter the way you do a building door. I think the idea is that by using these NS icons, you either move north or south, which is to say, into or out of the screen to jump to a track of jungle parallel to your current location. This concept would be presented in a more visually intuitive way in Electro Cop for Lynx a year later, and it would basically be the foundation of indie sensation Fez in another era of gaming altogether. Here, it's pretty confusing unless you draw it out on paper and realizing that north or south basically shifts you to a different track of the world, with a fairly consistent alignment of icons shuttling you between those tracks. What makes it more confusing than it necessarily needs to be is the fact that the north and south icons don't always have equivalents in the new track. You'll often move between layers of the world only to discover you've embarked on a one-way trip and don't have access to an icon, so you can't simply backtrack to where you were. This setup makes Rambo a chore to map out, and this is a game that really does demand you map out the jungle layout in order to make sense of your progress. At the same time, it also controls pretty roughly, which makes the moment-to-moment gameplay frustrating as well. Rambo's knife attacks have a bit of wind-up that takes getting used to if you want to avoid taking it on the chin every time you try to attack a random wasp or spider. Ranged attacks allow you to keep a safe distance, but those are all consumable and often less powerful than the basic trench knife. Some of the game's more frustrating moments combine these design quirks. There are a few bridges where you have to maneuver between rising bubbles straight out of Zelda 2, and if you're hit, you'll fall through the bridge and find yourself forced to jump jungle tracks on a north-south icon to retrace your steps back to make another attempt. And there's also the part where you have to leap across a series of rock outcroppings while avoiding falling boulders. Slip up or take a bad hit, and you'll plummet to the area below, where you need to avoid powerful gorillas to make your way back up the mountain for another attempt. These parts really suck the fun out of the game. I also think a lot of Rambo's bad reputation comes from the fact that it looks so ridiculous. The dialogue portraits are just unbelievably amateurish. You know how you hear about the way pixel artists used to take advantage of the blending effect of CRT screens and composite or RF connections? This is not one of those case studies. Rambo's portraits look terrible, and no portrait looks worse than the protagonist's. Stallone has always looked kinda dopey, but his picture here is less Rambo and more Rocky Balboa after taking a few too many blows to the soft part of the skull. On top of that, Packin's graphic designers inserted some goofy Japanese gag humor that doesn't really fit the tone of the game. Like the boss whose head turns enormous when he takes damage, or the way you can scream kanji at the CIA contact to transform him into a frog. All of this is to say that Rambo for NES is a hot mess. But it's not a hot mess in the sense of an Atlas LJN game or a Micronix SNK joint. It's the kind of hot mess you get when a B-tier studio gets a hold of a license and decides to skip the easy cash-in route and instead tries to do something grand and on-trend with it. Packin Video is simply punching above their weight here, and reality beat them down like Clubber Lang going to town on Apollo Creed. Next time on NES Works, Solid Snake makes his ultra-cool debut in the world's greatest Super Rambo special ripoff.